Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I hope the light's not too bad. I'm sitting out here on the porch in the dark. This probably looks okay. Alrighty. So in this live cast, as you guys probably know, live stream, we're going to talk about channeling, which of all of the ESP or psychic type phenomena, I'm probably the most critical and skeptical of channeling. Not because I don't think that we have the capacity to make contact with other types of consciousness, but because the overwhelming majority of material that is presented as being channeled does not necessarily strike me as requiring non-human intelligence to have received. And in the Western occult tradition, we say that you generally won't consider this kind of stuff unless there is some direct proof of knowledge of future events that's very specific or something that suggests some preter-human kind of knowledge. Having said that, there is definitely some material that I feel does present that way. And we're going to start with some of my personal experiences that I have never really been able to explain in any other way. Telepathy, actually, which is something that I am 100% convinced of. I have experienced it numerous times with numerous people in such a way that it is pretty much impossible for me to dismiss it. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that in most of the cases where I was able to access information that I couldn't possibly know, the person that I was talking to would have had this information in their own consciousness. And so the possibility that there was no other spiritual agency or that I was receiving this information from the dead, the possibility that it was just telepathy definitely is present. So after I relate my experiences, fake mediums, and actually I'm glad you reminded me of that. There were a lot of warnings about channeling, and I think that there are a lot of reasons why we should take them seriously. And I'm not talking about just the possibility that we could contact some negative entity that has some maleficent intent, but also, for example, I've noticed that there's a lot of very famous, well-known New Age sort of channelers that are claiming that interdimensional beings are telling them that Trump is a light being and that he actually works for them. And I have a really hard time accepting that possibility. If there is divinity and there is a divine plan, everything is part of it. Absolutely. But to suggest that Donald Trump is consciously trying to liberate the consciousness of mankind and defend us from some kind of dark satanic influence seems a bit much. And I would suggest that the motivation that a lot of these people might have is that when world events go a certain way, they can sort of validate their channeled information by explaining current events with their channeled info. You know what I mean? So I think that can be very dangerous. Also, Aleister Crowley, even, who was, a lot of people think a dark magician, he definitely would do just about anything. And he actually warned against channeling, saying that he actually compared it to passing a condom around, only you're doing this with your body, with your being. And that because most people, like most New Age housewives, haven't gone through rigorous training to be able to identify an intelligence. So they might think they're channeling Elizabeth Taylor, and they're actually talking to Beelzebub. And there actually is protocol that's taught in various Hermetic fraternities or in the mysteries that give the magician the ability to test beings and make sure that they actually know what it is that they're dealing with. So this is definitely not something I think that we should take lightly. I also want to mention that even though I might be critical and skeptical, even if channeling isn't legitimate in the sense that we are actually contacting other intelligences, I think it could have great utility as a practice, even if all it is that you're contacting is your own subconscious mind. I think a lot of great art has been produced in this way. And so, it's something to be cautious and skeptical and enter into with some preparation and healthy skepticism. But even if we were to come to the conclusion that channeling had nothing to do with external intelligences, it could still have some efficacy as a spiritual practice or a practice designed to enhance our consciousness or expand our creative capacity or any number of things. Okay, so before I get into the stories, I'll answer this. I'll answer both of these questions, but the one from Bodhi Music, I will get to that. But the spirit possession question, I am pretty skeptical of this. I notice there's a lot of fear out there in the spiritual community regarding negative entities and having these attachments. And I don't claim to be all-knowing, but my research, my experience, my individual gnosis suggests to me that our will is sovereign and that it cannot be compromised or influenced without our permission or an agreement or some kind of necessity. And I think that it's not something I'm particularly concerned with. I would also point out that, if you look on Facebook, there are massive groups full of people that engage in dark magical practices. And I don't feel like, I've literally sat for hours and scrolled through and read and communicated with people. There's definitely not a whole lot of indication that these people are becoming possessed or losing their minds, or even that they're developing any kind of like evil inclinations based on whatever this dark magic is that they're doing. And so I think that if this was as much of a concern as people seem to think that it is, when we look at left-hand path communities, we should see a lot of evidence of that. And I don't know that we really do. So, okay, my personal experiences. The first time that I experienced anything that I would consider possibly categorizing as channeling, I was named after a friend of my mother's who was like a soulmate. I think they were like 16 or something when he died. And so my middle name is his first and middle name, James Michael. And she had always told me that he had died in a motorcycle accident. And that's how I ended up with the first name Harley, right? Which is definitely not true. And that was the first indication that I had that I needed to press her about this if I wanted the truth. Because the guy that she ended up marrying, who wasn't my biological father, was all about Harley Davidsons. And he told me that he was upset that she wanted to name me after this other guy. And he said, okay, we can compromise, and his first name will be Harley. And I knew that that was true. So fast forward, 30 years, this was about 10 years ago. I was deeply into my, what I call the Phoenix process period that a lot of my videos are based around. And part of that was that I wanted answers regarding who I was and the various influences that, made me who I am. And my name is obviously part of that. So one day out of the blue, I felt compelled to call my mother up. And I didn't even have a plan, I don't think, when I first dialed the number. But, I talked to her for a few minutes, pleasantries, whatever. And then I said, so what really happened to James Michael? And there was just silence for a while. And she said he huffed himself to death. He got drunk and he huffed himself to death. And so I didn't really know where to go next. You know, I'd gotten the truth, but I felt like there was something more. And this voice in my head said, ask her about Steve Miller. And without hesitation, I said, what does Steve Miller have to do with this? And she silence again, much longer this time, I'm sure. And she says, that's the guy that he caught his girlfriend cheating on him with that provoked him to kill himself. So I think we should consider that there's pretty much no possibility that my mother had mentioned this to me because she had lied to me. And she only lied to me about it because I was a little kid, I think, when she told me the story, and she didn't want to bring the whole drug overdose element into it. So I think we can pretty fairly rule that out. And also her reaction, it really freaked her out. You know, she said, oh my God, like, what is going on with you? She didn't talk to me for like 2 weeks. I don't remember exactly what her response was, but she was definitely pretty freaked out. And that also implies that, you know, she had never told me the truth, obviously. So once again, though, the possibility of telepathy is in the equation because she had this information, right? And that's really all there is to that story. But that was the first time I had an experience. Oh, okay. Also, I think I should mention, what the hell was that voice? It wasn't my voice. I don't exactly remember the qualities of it. I think it was androgynous. I think I remember noticing that it didn't really seem to be male or female. It was just like this weird whisper in my ear. Ask her about Steve Miller. What the hell is that? So the next phase of the story is actually considerably stranger. And if you read the description of this video, I mentioned that channeling almost got me killed by the Mexican mafia, which is absolutely true. And so at some point during the Phoenix process, I had been initiated into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is like a quasi-Masonic fraternity. The lineage is definitely legitimate. It was started by two 33-degree Freemasons in 1888, McGregor Mathers and I can't remember the other guy's name, but two 33rd degree Freemasons that broke off from the main lodge. And basically the deal is if you're a 33rd degree, you do have the right to break away from the main body and start your own thing. So that's what these guys did. William Yeats, Aleister Crowley, a lot of famous people were associated with the original incarnation. Israel Regardie, the Stella Matutina is the specific branch because, you know, if you guys know anything about this stuff, you're aware probably that there are two main bodies of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that both kind of claim to be legitimate. Israel Regardie, who was Aleister Crowley's secretary, was a member of the same lineage that I was, the Stella Matutina. And based on Israel Regardie's affiliation with it, I chose that one as being probably the legitimate order. And so I had joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And the head of the order is a guy named Robert. And he had this incredible capacity to call me when I was maybe hung up on some metaphysical question or there was some like puzzle piece in my journey that I was stuck on. It could be 3 a.m. and my phone would ring and I would answer it. And he would say something cryptic and weird, and it would, within a few minutes, it would click and it would solve my conundrum, whatever I was stuck on. He had an incredibly uncanny ability to do this. In fact, one of my next live streams is going to be my contact story, partly in light of the fact that the Pentagon just released a document saying that they have recovered craft that are not from Earth. So basically, at this juncture in human history, with all the other crap that's going on, we have the Pentagon legitimately saying that it is in possession of UFOs. And so, partly in light of that fact, because I feel like within, a matter of months, contact could be announced, and then my story about, my own experience with interdimensional or non-terrestrial beings not have so much interest because the whole planet is experiencing it, right? So I want to get this done next week. But what I'm saying is that was the biggest instance where this guy did this. The night that we had this contact experience, he actually called me. We were driving home. I put him on speakerphone because I was driving, so my girlfriend heard this as well. Speaking of live streams, I'm going to try to do an interview with her because she was present for a lot of the crazier stuff that happened at some point, so keep an eye out for that. But he said contact is imminent, and when we got home, sure enough, we had a contact experience. I mean, within 20 minutes of getting off the phone with this guy. And the next day, which this is probably the most compelling element of the story, every single person that I encountered, all with no relationship to each other, had seen them as well that night. So it really does appear that the entire town was sort of infested with these things. And I was told that would happen that night by this secret society guy. So one day during my Phoenix process, I'm driving home from somewhere, I don't remember where, and something had suddenly changed. During this period, it wasn't super dramatic, but it's like colors were more vivid. I was always sort of ecstatic. There was a sort of feeling of connection. And suddenly, that had all disappeared. And so I pulled over to the side of the road, and I called Robert, and I said, I explained what had happened. And he said, you have achieved illumination. And I remembered a line from a book called the Illuminatus Trilogy, which, by the way, if you guys haven't read it, best book ever written. Timothy Leary said it was more important than Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. It's an extraordinary book. I'm not going to get too deep into it because I'm going to actually make a video of sort of book reviews in the coming weeks. But from this Illuminatus trilogy, and also Robert, not only did he share a name with the author, he talked so much like him that the first time he sent me a message and I put it on speakerphone, my roommates, two of them, who had just watched a documentary with Robert Anton Wilson, all of us, our eyes bugged out because we thought for a second, that is Robert Anton Wilson. Because all he said is, hello, this is Robert with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is part of the plot in the book. And we're all just standing around going like, what in the hell? Eventually we figured out that's not what happened, but it was weird because what he said to me about having achieved illumination, my next thought came from that book, which was, before illumination, mountains are mountains. During illumination, mountains are no longer mountains. But after illumination, mountains are once again mountains. And I was in Colorado. So, of course, I'm staring at some gigantic 14,000 foot snow-capped mountain while this is all transpiring. Right? So pretty incredible. And then Robert says to me, there's something that you need to do. And I said, okay. But then he just hung up. And I was like, what the hell? So I'm driving into town, phone rings. He says, I need you to get to a computer. And this was like 10 years ago. And I didn't even start using the internet until like 2011. That's a long story, but it's true. I didn't grow up with a computer in my house. I just never acquired the habit. And I don't know that smartphones even existed then. Maybe they did. I wouldn't have been aware because it just wasn't a thing for me. So I had to go to an actual computer. I didn't even own one, unsurprisingly, I guess. So I was very close to a friend's house. I shouldn't use his real name, so we'll call him Javier. And I knew that he supposedly had a past as like a Mexican gangbanger in Mexico, his whole family. They were banditos, which is like the biker gang arm of the Mexican mob. But you know how people are. They brag, they exaggerate, they talk a lot. So I didn't really take it that seriously. He seemed like this nice old man. I knew his brother. I was a medical marijuana provider. His brother had AIDS and cancer, and he was one of my patients. You know, I knew his whole family. I knew his son. It never really occurred to me that this guy was dangerous. So I think, well, I know that Javier just got a computer, and I was right by his house. So I went over, knocked on the door, and said, "Hey, can I use your computer for a minute?" He said, "Sure, come on in." But he came with me. So we go back to the computer, sit down. I call Robert back, and I say, "Okay, I'm at a computer. What do you want me to do?" And he gives me a URL. So I go to this website, and it's the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and there's a picture of McGregor Mathers in his ceremonial garb. And Javier says, "That's my fucking brother." And I looked at him, and I'm like, "No, that's McGregor Mathers." And he's totally freaked. Like, "No, dude, that is my brother. What the fuck is going on?" Like, he starts getting like visibly agitated. So I'm like, "Okay, Robert, what is this?" Like, you know, I'm like scrolling. I see a place where you can like enter your credit card information and pay your like yearly dues or whatever. And he's like, "No, this isn't about money." And I'm like, "What the hell?" And suddenly it clicks. I just knew I am here to convince Javier to forgive the guy that shot his brother dead in Mexico. And so I said to Robert, "I think I get it." He said, "Okay." I hung up the phone, and I said, "Javier, let's go into the living room and have a talk." So I go out in the living room. He sits down in a chair in the corner. I sit down on the floor, and I've never really consciously attempted to do something like this before, right? So I'm like, "What do I do?" And I had a little bit of pot. And I thought, you should just take like just one hit of pot. Like, don't get like really stoned, but you need to like open up your consciousness to receive this information. And I should interject here that I think it was like last night, maybe the night before, I was thinking about all this. And this voice in my head, maybe this is channeling as well, explained to me that because marijuana is feminine, it creates space in our consciousness. And the universe, including our consciousness, is a bunch of mathematical relations, right? And so in our normal state of consciousness, with all of our filters up, that, you know, if you know Dennis McKenna and some other neurobiologists have this theory that psychedelics actually just bring down filters that screen out the majority of information and light, and so that we can focus on pragmatic stuff. It's like an evolutionary adaptation that we don't perceive all of the universe all of the time. So marijuana doesn't really bring these filters down to the degree that something like ayahuasca or DMT or, you know, 20 years of practice meditating might do. But it does open us up. And the analogy that I was given was that it's kind of like the difference in density between steel and water. Our normal consciousness is like steel, and it can't easily be penetrated by these other incoming signals, right? But you smoke a little bit of pot, and it's like there's more space, and now we have changed the density of our consciousness from steel to water, right? And I don't know if you saw my last live stream, but I was live scream. That's not bad. I was talking about how this guru used to teach that the universe is really just one thing doing one thing. That analogy, I feel like, kind of illustrates that, right? So at any rate, I take a hit of pot. I close my eyes, and everything turns this very specific shade of purple. And this was not like those TV psychics where they're like, Peter, Paul, Petunia, does any of this mean anything to you? And the person's like, no. The first time. You know what I mean? Like I said, what does Charlie have to do with this? And he said, that was my brother's dog. And I was like, okay, what about Christina? And he said, that was the bitch that got him shot. And at that point, I'm realizing this is really happening, whatever this is. So this entire process took probably maybe like an hour and a half. And eventually, it turned out that the guy that had killed Javier's brother had already been killed. So he had spent his whole life ate up with this idea of revenge. I've got to avenge my brother's death, but the guy's already dead. I can't kill him. So it's like he couldn't get his revenge. And it had just eaten him alive for years and years and years and years. And I wish I could remember the whole conversation, but like I said, it was 10 years ago. But eventually, I got Javier to understand that he needed to forgive the guy that killed his brother on behalf of his brother even. And so here's the weirdest part, though. The moment that he said, okay, I'll forgive this guy, this thing, there was a lamp right beside Javier's head. This thing that kind of looked like a mosquito hawk. You guys know that? It's like a giant mosquito. Only it was way too big. It was massive. Like, mosquito hawks are like, maybe that big at the most. This thing was like that and thick, but it was the same color and had basically the same build. Comes out of the lamp, floats right in front of Javier's face for a second, and he looks at it like, kill it, And I was like, no, because I just had this like intuition, like, that's your brother, don't smash it, And I fully acknowledged the possibility that it was just some weird giant bug that just happened to emerge at that very moment. But he didn't kill it. It flew out the window. So again, even though I accessed information that couldn't possibly be known to me, the person that I was talking to had this information in their being. So once again, I don't know that we really have solid evidence of channeling exactly, but also I think this offers an opportunity for me to illustrate what really matters about all of this stuff, right? Because my motivation personally for even considering something like channeling is the fact that I feel like it presents us with some evidence that we are part of a greater consciousness. And that is what really has value for me. Because what I've noticed is that when people have experiences of that consciousness directly, it seems to have an influence on how they relate to the world, right? This is basically an element of gnosis. So regardless of the actual mechanistic explanation for it, these things have value in that sense. So how did this almost get me killed? It didn't occur to me that because Javier was Catholic, that channeling stuff from dead people in his living room was not going to go over well. And a few days later, I ran into his son, and he said, man, what the fuck are you thinking? And I was like, what? And he was like, you almost got your head blown off. My dad is Catholic. He's a bandito. While you were sitting there channeling all this stuff, he's thinking this guy's possessed by Satan, and he was thinking about blowing your head off the whole time you were sitting there. Like, you almost provoked my dad to shoot you in the head. So that was that experience, and it actually got considerably worse, but I think I'll save that story for later. Okay, so the one experience that I've had that actually suggests, well, I shouldn't say the one, but probably the most incredible was actually during an ayahuasca experience. And I've made a video about this, ayahuasca and the star tribes, where I received information about a star system that was not known to earthly astronomers until 5 to 10 days after I received the information. And another thing that makes this notable is that there were like a dozen witnesses, because after I received the information at the end of the night, the talking stick goes around, everybody talks about what happened. I told everybody in the teepee exactly what was transmitted to me. And one or two of the people that were present in that teepee were actually in the room 10 days later when it occurred to me I should Google this. And there was a paper that had just been published that said that it's always been known that there's a third body of some kind near Sirius A and Sirius B, but it's never really determined exactly what it was. And what I was told is that the influence of the two stars had stopped this gas giant from becoming a red dwarf. And there was a whole bunch of other information about the beings that inhabited and their function in the universe. Like I said, I already made that video. So if you want to check it out, you can find the link on my channel. I'll put a card tomorrow or something on this live stream. But in that case, I actually received information that I couldn't even have pulled from the collective consciousness of mankind, like the Akashic record or whatever, because nobody knew it. So that particular experience, I feel like, is very provocative of, to me, it's almost like proof that this intelligence can communicate information. And another element of this is that since I have experienced telepathy with human beings, and I've also received information in dreams, I was shown where a very rare secret book of the Masons that I was specifically hunting for would be in a used bookstore in a dream. And I actually told my girlfriend at the time what book we were going to get, how I'd receive the information, so that I had a witness to the whole thing, and it was right where it was in the dream. So I'm pretty well convinced that we can receive information from some type of consciousness other than our own being. This has happened to me a number of times. And if we can receive information from other humans telepathically, why couldn't we receive it from aliens? And at this point, even the Pentagon is telling us that, yes, there actually are aliens. I mean, they're saying that they've, retrieved crashed craft of a non-earthly origin. The book was Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike. And it's important to note what I said earlier about how I didn't use the internet at the time. This book was originally, like, it has a stamp in the front that says it's supposed to be returned to the lodge if the recipient leaves Freemasonry or if he dies. Now it's not that hard to find. You can probably order on Amazon for $50 or something, but it wouldn't have occurred to me to look online at the time. So I thought I just had to go and find a copy of this book, but I knew that it had revelations that would help me in my journey. And so I was searching for it pretty hard, and I had this dream. And like I said, I told someone, because during this period, the Phoenix process that I'm always referring to, I was very careful not to put suggestions in other people's heads, right? Like, I had a friend, this isn't quite channeling, I guess, but we would have shared experiences. One night it was really, really dramatic. I had this crazy experience with this blue light, and I looked at the clock. I was like floating off my bed. It was 5:30 in the morning. This girl called me the next day from 400 miles away, and she said, "What happened at 5:30 in the morning last night?" And I didn't answer because I didn't want to put it in her head. I actually said, "What happened to you at 5:30?" And it was exactly the same thing that happened to me from 400 miles away. So, and part of the reason I'm talking about this is that with telepathy, I used to think that our brain waves, if we can read them with machines, I'm sure the human mind has the capacity to pick up and interpret just like a radio or whatever, But I've had experiences of telepathy from with my current partner. When she was in South America and I was in North America, sometimes I would have a question and not like something really obvious, and she would answer me within a minute or two. And that forced me to accept that this is not necessarily predicated on being close together. So if it can happen from a continent away, who says we can't receive information from the stars? And this is probably a good time for me to also add that every phenomenon that we experience has some kind of mechanistic basis, or it can't happen as long as we are in this realm of creation, right? And this is actually taught by the ancient adepts, that the magician can safeguard himself by remembering that he cannot overturn even a minuscule law. Everything that happens has to be permitted and even facilitated by natural law, right? So it occurred to me that the theory of entanglement actually could explain why it is that I could receive information instantly, telepathically, from another star system. Because if all of the energy in the universe knows the position and activity of every other particle and responds instantaneously regardless of distance, we still can accept the possibility of interstellar telepathy without violating the laws of creation. Right? And that's very powerful for a number of reasons. If you believe you've had a subjective experience, and maybe this doesn't even really bear elucidation, but one of my main focuses or acknowledgments, I guess, is that I don't think generally people question their subjective experience to the degree that they necessarily should, right? And I feel like the next step in our spiritual evolution that's part of it, to employ this sort of rational skepticism balanced with an open mind, right? I saw a really good quote about this just the other day. It was something like, be open to anything and attached to nothing. And, I'm sure, as you guys can tell, that's what I'm trying to do. I've had these experiences that pretty much insist that something more than our standard deterministic, interpretation of consciousness and the universe, that it goes further. But I think we really do need to be careful and a little bit more selective about what we let in and what we don't. Okay, so one more experience I guess I will share, and then we'll do a little bit of critical analysis. And also I'll talk about the one document. And by the way, in regards to this document, this isn't just my opinion. There are people that are actually professional skeptics, right? Highly educated people that look at stuff like Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce and whatever. And their job is to determine if there's any reason to consider it as evidence for, prophetic insight or any of these things that are claimed by the authors or that the people that have read this stuff have interpreted. right? That's their job. And the Book of the Law by Aleister Crowley is actually the only document in existence that professional skeptics have consistently looked at and not dismissed, right? Like every one of them has looked at Nostradamus and said it's too vague, you know, this doesn't mean anything. Or Edgar Cayce, right? They've totally dismissed all of it. But the Book of the Law, one of them said, what was his exact words? Interesting, but not conclusive, right? Because it doesn't prove it, but it very strongly implies some kind of preternatural knowledge that would not be accessible to a human at that time. Okay, so the last experience that I was going to convey, and this is more along the lines of like contact with a spirit. Some of you guys might know the Grateful Dead has been a massive influence on me. And in case you're not familiar, I'll try to explain a little bit about it. The idea was basically that there's a bigger consciousness that we can connect with. The Dead figured out, the band, you know, they figured out that psychedelics brought down these filters and gave us easier access to the collective consciousness. And they would do these improvisations where things would happen in the music. You know, we have like 7 people on stage, 2 drummers, keyboards, 2 guitars, bass, totally freeform improv, and things would happen that sounded like, you know, Bach had composed them, but they're even more impossible than that, you know, and basically impossible just suddenly arises out of the gobbledygook. And when that would happen, there was like this charge of energy that would go out into the audience, and the effect that it had on the audience was that they would become more spiritual, less violent, you know. And the first time I actually experienced it live, I noticed that the band actually wasn't singing about this stuff. So you couldn't say, well, it's just the message in the lyrics that people are picking up on, because they didn't put it in the lyrics. I mean, they played like 3,000 songs or something over their career, which also, by the way, makes no sense. Most bands go out and they play the same show every night for a whole tour. The Dead only repeated a set list once in 30 years, and they played every song that they did repeat differently every single time, which really defies, like, that makes no sense. In fact, when Rolling Stone magazine in 1987 asked Jerry Garcia if they did it, he said, well, I basically had the capacity to handle it, and I took so much acid that all the filters in my mind came down, and I'm able to access sort of these filing cabinets that have all the information in the universe, and I can just kind of scroll through it and pick whatever I want. And it was incredible to kind of witness this guy, because he would say shit like that, but he was so humble, like, oh, you know, it's no big deal. Like, millions of people think I'm God, and I illuminate people that come into my presence, you know, that I vibrate at. And he was still just kind of like, yeah, it's no big deal, you know. So that's been a major influence on me. And so one day during this Phoenix process period, this was probably within a week of some of the other stories I told you guys, I was playing my guitar, and suddenly there was like this flash of like this blinding white light. I think it flashed like 2 or 3 times. And I did have this feeling of like something happening, like I absorbed something. And I stopped and I was like, what in the hell was that? And this voice, I think the same voice that told me that I should ask my mother about Steve Miller, said, you just, how did it put it? Merged with the spirit of Jerry Garcia. And I was like, okay, I have officially become an acid casualty. Like, that's the kind of stupid shit that the guy, the deadhead that's taken too much acid believes. And, you know, I just kind of dismissed it. But then the next day, my roommate, who I played guitar with every single day, we just started a band together, all this stuff, right? Totally normal protocol, comes into my room, sits down, and we start playing together. And I play this phrase of just maybe like 6 notes, and he bursts into tears and runs away. And I was like, what the hell just happened? It didn't seem extraordinary to me. So I went to his room and I sat down on his bed and I said, Fred, we'll call him. What the hell? And he's just like, man, I'm just so humbled. Like, I don't know what just happened in there. And I thought, well, that's odd, you know? So a few hours later, the rest of the band comes over for rehearsal. And the singer didn't really like the Dead, just not his thing. So he wasn't familiar with their style, or, he wouldn't recognize anything. We go out in the backyard, and to warm up, we would always just do a jam. And so we're playing, and I play this phrase, and I kind of knew something had happened, but it's difficult to explain. When I get to that place, it's kind of like a trance. I'm not really home exactly, but the band just crashed, right? The drummer just sputtered out. Bass player stopped and looked at me. The singer turns around with his eyes bugged out, right? And he goes, "Damn, Jerry." And I was like, weird, So over time, once the band started going out and gigging, people started saying really crazy things to me. Like, I haven't experienced anything like that since Garcia in '74, old heads. And people started saying, man, when you guys are playing, it's like a portal. The whole audience becomes telepathic, and there's like a portal with this information from another dimension that we all just start downloading. And this was happening like routinely and regularly. And if you guys watch the Skeleton Man video that I made, I tell the story of where that all went. And it's not like I know all of Garcia's tricks or totally understand his formula. Still to this day, I study his solos. I struggle with a lot of his stuff. It's not like I suddenly just knew everything he knew, but in terms of having this very specific energetic or consciousness altering effect on people, suddenly I seem to have that after this experience of connecting with what this voice in my head told me was the spirit of Garcia. One more that I will mention, and I don't know, once again, this is information that the person that I was talking to did know. But my friend that I mentioned that I had all of these experiences with, her sister had apparently committed suicide when she was very young. And when she told me that, without hesitation, I said she didn't kill herself. And my subjective experience of it was that her sister was sort of, I guess you kind of explain it as like standing behind me, but in my mind, like that's kind of the best I can do. It was like this ghost basically had just told me I didn't kill myself. And that's why I said that. And then my friend said, well, actually, there were very suspicious circumstances. She had a very possessive and controlling boyfriend that was very abusive, and she was found hung by her stockings, which seems a bit weird. You would have think she would have done something else. I don't know. So that pretty much wraps up my experiences in regards to channeling. There is some other stuff that might fall under this category. No, dude. Okay, this is totally off subject, but I do feel that it's so relevant that I should address it. George, a complete collapse of the U.S. economy. Just analyzing this in like Hermetic terms, I guess, or I don't know how exactly to put it, but the way I understand the universe, basically, right? My ontological evaluation of the whole thing is that there are laws that govern all systems, from, the Forex market to consciousness, everything. And one of those that is applicable to that is that chaos gives rise to order. So whether we're moving into a complete control, fascism-based new world order, or a new order of higher consciousness and greater compassion and spiritual awareness and international gnosis, it's pretty much guaranteed that we're going to experience chaos before that new system can really coagulate. So I hear you, man. And I wish I had something really positive to offer. And I do, maybe. And that is that I do feel like this is all going somewhere. I don't feel like I would have had these experiences and been prepped for all of this just to watch it all go up in flames, And I do realize that same thought has passed through the head of many soldiers laying in the rocks with a bullet in their stomach while they're dying and thinking, really, or in a car accident or whatever, So I have my doubts, but overall, I do feel like no matter how much chaos and confusion and ridiculousness we're seeing, something in me says that this is all going to a place that makes sense. Okay, so we got a little bit off topic. So I just want to mention quickly the Book of the Law. I mentioned it earlier, but the particular parts of that book that, for those of you that don't know, it was Crowley and his, I don't know if she was fiance at that point or if they had actually been married, but I think it was Rose Crowley. They dressed up as like Middle Eastern royalty. And Crowley was very wealthy, so I'm sure they had like legit jewels all over them and like looked, you wouldn't have questioned them. And the plan was that they were going to convince whoever they needed to convince at the Egyptian, government, embassy, whatever, that they should let them honeymoon in the king's pyramid or the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. And so they were successful in doing so. And so they channeled this being that Crowley called Iwas. And it dictated to him an hour a day for 3 days, April 8th, 9th, and 10th, the Book of the Law, which was basically describing where humanity was going and why it was going there. And one of the most interesting things to me about the book is that, and this is something I struggle with a lot, people tend to think of like higher states of consciousness and enlightenment and illumination as influences that make a person harmless and kind and gentle and full of compassion and love. But the Book of the Law has that element to a certain extent, but it also seems like it's very brutal. We will stamp down the wretched and the weak, the unfit and the misfit are not of us, and all of this sort of stuff. But it occurred to me that is almost more reflective of nature. And if God is nature, then the way that this consciousness presents in the Book of the Law, even with all of its sort of aggression and hostility, actually more accurately reflects nature than these other ideas about higher states of consciousness. And, I've even considered that maybe even, practices like Buddhism are really just kind of engineered to keep people docile and, they are still sort of religious propagandized weapons. But I don't want to get too off track. The really convincing parts of the Book of the Law, there's a couple of things. One of them is that it was a few years before World War I, which eventually came to be called the Great War. And in the book, the being tells him the new eon will officially commence when the world is soaked in blood in the Great War. And of course, you guys know, like, technology took off, and it kind of does actually seem like the current period that we live in kind of commenced around that time. And some of the other descriptions that he gave of what this new period of human evolutions would look like are shockingly accurate. He talks about how people will become more bisexual and epicene, that we will make contact with these other types of consciousness by taking strange drugs, like, DMT. People smoke DMT and they come into contact with these entities all the time. I just saw, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, Shane Mouse, I guess, this comedian, was talking about how he'd been smoking DMT for a while. And one day he's like, okay, you need to show me somehow conclusively whether or not this stuff is actually coming from my own mind or not. And so a few days later, a friend of his came over and he had never smoked DMT before. So Shane said, okay, here, try it. So the guy smokes a bunch of DMT And before this, I guess I missed something. Shane had described that there was this purple girl that he would meet in the DMT realm that he felt like he had known for thousands of lifetimes, and they were just like unbelievably close and all this. And so he had asked, prove to me that this isn't just in my head. So his friend smokes a DMT, and he says, there's this purple girl in here that says she knows you, and she wanted to tell you whatever, something that she'd already said to him, like, pretty convincing, right? So the Book of the Law mentions all of that stuff. It actually talks about how the governments are going to start to function. But the main thing is that there is specific, it's not like Nostradamus. It's not like, there will be a guy with a green hat that is in this country and it's not all this cryptic stuff. It's very direct, very clear, very concise, specific, and even addresses events that have not occurred yet by name. So one of the reasons I mentioned that is because at the beginning of this live stream, I had said that most of the channeled material that I encounter is not impressive. I feel like there's no reason to predicate the reception of this stuff on some advanced being or ascended master. I've also thought, why would Saint Germain just be sitting around Mount Shasta to, convey the same kind of lessons we've been hearing from spiritual teachers for thousands of years to, dozens of New Age housewives around? It just doesn't really get me. And there are exceptions. I wish I could remember the names of a few of these books where I've seen things that was like, wow, that actually does seem like it could legitimately have come from some other source. So again, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that all of that stuff is not legitimate. I'm just saying that I'm not impressed by the overwhelming majority of it. I try to approach these subjects with a sort of scientific, at least pseudo-scientific disposition. And I'm just offering that the Book of the Law is the one supposedly channeled document that I feel like actually has specificities and information that would not have been known to any human on earth, that is contained within its pages, regardless of how you feel about the disposition of the being that is communicating it all. That's funny that you asked that, Bodhi Music. Also, I should mention to the Restoration of Identity guy, since you're talking about the Book of the Law and actually reading it, I think that if it's true that he had contact with some other being, I think it went in and out, like when you have like a bad internet connection or something, because there are times where it literally just becomes like strings of letters and numbers that make no sense. And there are also places where you can see Crowley's writing style and his personality kind of come through. But then there are other places where it's like, holy shitballs, this was 110 years ago, and we are living in exactly the situation. Another thing, you guys, the depopulation agenda. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but a lot of the things that I think people are relegating to the realm of conspiracy are actually just totally obvious, and they are just part of the protocol of an elite body managing a planet. And population control has always been a concern of empire, right? In the intro to the Book of the Law, one of the things that struck me the most, he says, society only moves by the light of genius. The herd will be destroyed in mass. And if you look at what's happening right now and what's happened over the last couple of decades, those couple of lines right there should be enough to get just about anybody's attention. So what I'm really getting at, though, is that if you really want to look at Crowley and you're unfamiliar, the Book of Lies is actually the best place to start, I think. And there's a lot of places in that book where if you don't have a background in Jewish mysticism, if you don't know the Kabbalah, if you don't know the terminology, you're not going to understand. So it is worth it. If you come across any word that you don't know, Google it, understand what he's talking about, and read it again. I have had this book in my possession for 15 years or something, and every few months I will pick it up. And I think this is one of the ways that when something really has that divinity kind of inextricably intertwined in its substance, it continues to have layers of meaning. You know, if you read it and then put it down for 6 months and then pick it up again, read it again, it has not yet, in my experience, failed to elucidate, you know, deeper and unperceived layers of meaning. So the Book of Lies, so falsely called, is an extraordinary work in that regard. George, anything that has to do with the Freemasons is evil is absolutely not true. That is definitely, I can assure you, not true. For one thing, I am associated with the Masons, and I'm definitely not evil. What actually, the deal with that is that everything in this universe is dualistic. So there is the White Lodge and there's the Black Lodge, and they both serve a totally necessary function according to the understanding of Masons, right? Maybe the Black Lodge is just being justified and it's not actually valid, but and I'm going to do a totally separate video about this subject in particular, because this is a really tough one, I think, for people to get through their heads. But it's also something that has been recognized by Christian mystics. The Buddha mentioned it. Everything generates its opposite. So evil has just as much of a necessary, and it's not even evil. Evil, as I understand it, is just really an expression of the entropy that's produced by chaos, right? But at the end of the day, everything is equally necessary. So in the White Lodges, we don't look at the Black Brothers as something lesser. We don't hate them. You know what I mean? They're not exactly respected, but we understand their role and their necessity. And Freemasonry is definitely not purely evil. One way that you could think about it that I think is accurate is kind of like a Taoist. A Taoist, you know, because everything is expressed in everything else. You know, the Taoist master will tell his student who has just asked him a question to stare into a puddle with a leaf spinning in it to come up with his answer, right? And so the difference is the Taoist doesn't use his understanding of natural law. The Freemason does. And I would suggest to you or anyone that you find a PDF online of Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike. And if you want to see for yourself that the people that and how they do it, you only need like 2 pages of that book. Read the first 2 or 3 pages and you'll see what I mean. How they see populations as energy, that the influences in terms of geometry. It's fucking incredible. And just read the first 2 pages of his book. But I seriously disagree with the assertion that anything Masonic is evil. In fact, I think that opinion is cultivated by the people that seek to suppress the evolution of consciousness, because what even Crowley's work, which was Masonic, and the Masons kind of represents is a compendium of thousands of years of occult knowledge from different cultures. Back in the day, in the early Eleusinian mysteries, they used plants that contained DMT and harmalas. It's absolutely not true. And I would really strongly suggest to anyone that is really serious about developing their consciousness, but also grounding that in the material world, and making their life an expression of that in their work. And you know, I'm always talking about how conscious people need to embrace the idea of power. Freemasonry and the secrets that are entrenched therein are very powerful tools for anyone that is stepped foot on this path. Okay, so a quick recap of my opinion on channeling. It's difficult to answer because I don't necessarily exactly have an opinion on channeling. I'm skeptical of a lot of allegedly channeled material because I don't think it really presents any evidence. For example, what's that guy's name? You know, Conversations with God. If I was God and I had an important message to deliver to humanity, I would put something in there so that a rational thinking person would not have to insult their own intelligence by taking it seriously. You know what I mean? I would put something in there that only like God or some kind of higher dimensional being clearly and obviously would know in order to validate the information that was being presented. And I find it very circumspect that almost none of the channeled material that I have ever seen has any indication that that was the case. However, because I have been provoked by some unseen influence to go into specific situations, and then I had access to specific information that I couldn't possibly know that turned out to be accurate. And on top of that, the experiences I've had with plant medicine, where I have received very detailed, very specific information a number of times. I do, and also shamanism is basically channeling. And I have seen the efficacious results of shamans communing with plant spirits and myself, so it's a weird position that I'm in, because even though I do not really buy into the majority of the channeled material that I've encountered, I have to acknowledge that if I have received information from other people telepathically, I'm totally convinced of that. I have received information about future events that turned out to be very specifically correct from plant medicine experiences a number of times. I can't really say that, like what, am I the only person that, you know what I mean? Like I can't do that. And it's not that I'm inclined to, but my mission is, I have a commitment to truth. I don't want to encourage anyone else to believe anything that isn't objectively true, and I don't want to fall prey to delusion myself. So I'm very careful. And I guess what I'm saying is that when I engage my mechanisms of, skeptical analysis while maintaining an open mind, most of the channeled material doesn't really stand its ground, but I've seen some that does. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think people need to take their development a little bit more seriously. I think that ego is a huge problem in the spiritual community. People thinking that they have, capacities. Maybe they have correctly intuited or precognized once or twice, and then they start to believe that every thought that they have is an accurate intuition when it's actually not. There are just so many potential factors and influences. I guess if I had to summarize, what I would say is I think there's sufficient evidence that we are part of a greater consciousness, and that there are individual constituents of that consciousness that we do seem to receive relevant information from time to time. But as a collective, I guess I would advise that we need to be a little bit more cautious about what we accept, and be careful about not getting attached to ideas, so that we have certainty and not faith in regards to our spiritual and metaphysical being and our life and experience. So I guess that about wraps it up, guys. Thank you so much for taking part in this. I don't think I mentioned, I think Super Chat is enabled. We definitely appreciate contributions. We don't get any money from YouTube, even though our channel is monetized because of some technical complication. So also I want to mention, the Illuminatus trilogy and a bunch of other material that I have, that I very strongly recommend. My favorite books and music and a bunch of supplements and stuff. There's a link to our Amazon store in the comments. So if you guys want to support us, there's a couple of different options also on Patreon. So thanks a lot for watching. And let's see, is there any more questions? Maybe I'll do one more question. See, and this is what I'm talking about, restoration of identity. The one thing that I was conscious of not getting to, that your question seems to directly address it. So I will mention, it's a difficult thing to articulate though. But a good example would be, the other day when I was thinking about channeling, and it occurred to me that shamans basically are channeling plant spirits or Maybe the plant is just a gateway to another type of spirit. It attenuates our consciousness to be receptive to this frequency, and it's actually got nothing to do with the plant. Whatever the explanation is, I was thinking about that, and for the first time in my life, a couple hours later, I found an article where they said, the New Age movement has kind of revived the practice of shamanism, where you're channeling spirits in order to get relevant information. And more specifically, addressing that question, the other day, I was aware that I had kind of become more attuned. I had been kind of out of sorts, I guess. I don't know. I've been having some health problems. It makes my mind cloudy. And I've kind of been detached from what I think of as like my purpose. And I was aware that I had become more connected with that. And when that happens, I usually have the experience of synchronicities, et cetera. So I was on the bus coming home, and I was thinking about South Park, of all things. And I didn't say any of this out loud, so there's no chance that, Google heard me on my microphone on my phone or anything. And I was wondering about South Park's popularity in South America. I had never seen any reference to it down here. So I get home, I get on YouTube, and the first commercial I see, there's this Latin woman dressed like Cartman doing a commercial, and that sort of thing, which brings us back to, some of the warnings about channeling and just this whole process and the importance of skepticism and not being too invested in your narrative, I guess. Because I think a lot of people have these experiences and it actually triggers like psychotic breaks. I think that what you were referencing is an awareness of or it's a manifestation of a harmonious relationship to the greater consciousness. And shamans must actually gather knowledge from their trips that assist in medicine that works on universal knowledge. And to more specifically address that, I guess he's asking, shamans must actually gather knowledge from their trips that assist in medicine. Yes, I mean, the idea basically is that filters that normally screen out most of the incoming information and frequencies of light and stuff are temporarily brought down so that we have access to greater reservoir of knowledge. And what I was getting at with my stories about synchronicity and whatnot is that that is all part of an understanding of the universal mind and our relationship to it. So do me a favor, you guys, hit the like button, share, subscribe. Do tune in for the contact story. I think I'm going to do that this week. And then sometime soon, I'm also going to do a conspiracy theory versus the official narrative video. Again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think that one of the methods of the propaganda machine has been to convince people to tune out, even be remotely connected to conspiracy. And I think that has provoked people to laugh at a lot of ideas that it would behoove us to be very much aware of. So thanks again for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support, and we'll see you again very soon.